Snyder.
Chapter 25. The Barn. Anna Simmons. Upstate, Massachusetts, 2018. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Please, God, make me wake up. It's a dream. It's a nightmare. Wake up. Wake up, God. Please, please, God. Please, God. Please, God. Please, God. It can't be happening. It's not real. Jesus Christ, it can't be real. I want to wake up. God, please, make it stop. Make the pain stop. Please, God, please. Make the pain stop. It's a dream. It has to be a dream. Help me. Make it stop. Please, God, please. Help. Help us. It hurts too much. Please, help. Mommy. My daughter, Susie, cried. My daughter was gone. Sarah. She lay on the floor, bleeding from the head, but Susie she was sick, and she was alone. In the other room, I had left her alone, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. God, why can't I breathe? What is happening? Make me wake up, please. Why can't I breathe? Mommy! Susie shouted, frightened and alone. The sound of footsteps approached from beside me as a shadow appeared on my leg by the open doorway. I looked to Sebastian, at the gun in his hands, still in his hands even after he was gone. And now I can't breathe. Why can't I breathe? Mommy! Susie gasped, standing in the doorway. I turned towards her, snapping out of my delirium, to realize that the reason I couldn't breathe was because I had been screaming. I sucked in panicked, tearful gasps. The shock and sorrow of what had happened struck my little girl, and her face went blank, tears streaming down her cheeks. But as I tried to think of something I could say to her, as I tried to keep myself from succumbing to the unbearable pain, Susie fainted and collapsed to the floor. I slid along the ground towards her and placed my hands on her arms, covered in cold sweat from her sudden illness. I had tried to take her to the hospital, her and her sister, Sarah, but the roads were covered with people, crazy people who were attacking each other, who were attacking the car. I panicked and came home instead. Maybe if I had tried to stay, I could have gotten to a doctor. Maybe if I had stayed away from home, my husband wouldn't have gone crazy too. But he was right. He was right. And he tried to tell me, but I was too afraid to listen. Sarah had bitten him because I wouldn't listen, and now, oh God, no. Please, God, make me wake up. Please, God, please, please, God. I sobbed, shaking Susie's arms to try to wake her up, praying as hard as I could that when she did, she'd still be my little girl. Please, I begged, watching as her eyes fluttered open and she looked up to me, confused and distraught. Her head tilted off the ground and she looked forward at her sister's body, motionless on the floor beside her father's. Her lip quivered, and the memory of what she had seen flooded back to her. Sarah, she whimpered, barely able to believe what was in front of her. But before she could move any further or observe any more of what had happened, I leaned forward and pulled her towards me, hugging her as tight as I ever had, keeping her head to the side so that she couldn't look, so that she wouldn't have anything else burned into her memory that she could never get rid of. She hugged me back just as tight, and we cried, holding each other. The sound of growling echoed down the hall and into the room. Elvis, our old hound dog, was perched by the window at the front of the house, overlooking the fields surrounding us. At first, I ignored him, trying to focus only on my daughter so that I wouldn't drown in grief. But Elvis's growl slowly grew louder and louder until eventually he began to bark. I looked out of the corner of my eye to see him move from where he had been towards the door, clawing at the mat in front of it to try and get at whatever was on the other side. I glanced back over to the rifle in Sebastian's limp hands. but couldn't bring myself to approach his body or take anything from it. So instead, I slowly pulled myself off the floor, clutching Susie tightly to my breast, and walked towards the window to investigate what was happening. But just as I got within arm's reach of it, a sudden blow struck the door, making a loud banging sound that startled Susie. She clutched tightly to me and tried to hold me back, even though she was still ill and could barely walk. I placed my hands on her shoulders and knelt down as another hard thud landed against the door, while Elvis barked viciously at whatever was causing it. "Stay here, sweetie," I instructed, looking into her frightened and distraught eyes in order to remind myself that she needed me to be strong, that she needed me now more than ever, just as I needed her. "I'm scared," she cried, refusing to let go of my sleeve. "Me too," I admitted, forcing a slight smile to try and reassure her that despite the pain I felt, everything was going to be all right. "But it's going to be okay," I finished, feeling her grip loosen, letting me turn around and approach the banging at the door, pushing Elvis aside as I leaned in and looked through the peephole. Another thud landed hard against the door, cracking the wood just as my eyes were able to make out the empty-eyed stares of what my husband had assured me were infected people, two of which were now standing just outside the door, trying to break in. I took a startled step back and watched as pressure was applied to the crack, slowly spreading it along the door as the sound of hollow moans echoed from outside. I stood stunned for a moment until I felt Susie's hand grab onto mine and tug at me frantically. I turned around to see her panicked, terrified expression accompanied by a desperate whine urging me to run away. But before we could, I remembered the keys that Sebastian had thrown me, still lying on the ground in the other room beside Sarah's body. A section of the broken front door burst inward, revealing the piercing stare of an empty eye looking right at me. I didn't hesitate any longer. I couldn't allow myself to be paralyzed with fear. Elvis began backing away from the door, growling angrily at the intruders on the other side, as I turned and rushed towards the guest room. But as I reached the entrance, I had no choice but to stop, looking once more at the motionless bodies of my husband and daughter. And despite the sense of urgency I felt, I couldn't bring myself to walk in, even a single solitary step. The image of them where they were hurt me so much that once again it was hard to breathe. The sounds of moans and thuds grumbled behind me as Susie stood anxiously behind me, chattering her teeth. We didn't have much time. I looked down at the keys on the floor, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes, stretching my hand out blindly as I slid along the hard wood until I felt the cold metal of the keys, still wet with my daughter's blood. My stomach churned and I almost threw up, just able to stand and leave the room without losing myself to grief. I wiped the keys dry on my pant leg, able to breathe normally again until I spotted the outstretched arm of one of the infected, reaching through the broken door for me and my daughter. "Susie, follow me," I instructed urgently, taking her hand and rushing to the back door of the house, ripping open the lock and pulling the door in, gasping loudly as my eyes looked out over the fields that surrounded the house, each and every one of which was now covered with looming figures. Dozens of those things, all of which were headed in our direction. My heart sank and my daughter screamed, clutching tightly to my side with one arm while keeping the other pressed against her swollen stomach. "Hurry!" I yelled, breaking my eyes away from the hills and turning towards the barn. I held Susie's hand, moving faster than she could and tugging her along. But as we rounded the side of the house on the way to the barn, the infected that had been banging on the front door now stood waiting for us, 10 or more at least, each one spread out just enough so that we couldn't make it into the barn without running into them. We were trapped. I sucked in a tearful, panicked breath and stumbled back, scanning the hills for any way that we could escape. But there were just too many people. and there was nowhere to run. Susie cowered behind me, crying desperately, even more afraid than I was. But as we moved back, the infected began to swarm together, closing the gaps between each other and us, closer and closer. Then, after swiveling my head around to see another pack of people drudging towards us from the other direction, I knelt down, hoisted Susie up into my arms, and began walking towards the infected in between the house and the barn. Their mouths drooped open, and horrifying moans echoed across the land. Susie wrapped her arms around my neck and closed her eyes, pressing her trembling cheek against mine. But then, just as I stepped within 4 feet of the mob of people, I quickly ran to the side, taking advantage of the space that had been cleared as they lumbered slowly towards me, too slow to turn and grab me in time. I held my daughter tightly, just able to squeeze between the reach of their cold, dead hands. I dropped Susie, who landed uncertainly on her feet, and pulled the keys Sebastian had given me out of my pocket, frantically flipping through them for the one that would open the padlock to the barn. Susie pulled hysterically at my shirt, pressing her back against the barn door as the group of infected people that I had run around approached us, not 15 feet away. I tried a key. Nothing. I tried another. Wrong one. God, please, please, God, please. I squeezed my jaw tightly and concentrated with every fiber of my being, unable to turn around to see how close the infected had come. Mommy! Susie screamed, breathing so deep and fast that she looked as if she were going to faint. But just as I heard the cold moans of the people behind me come so close, I was sure they'd snatch us up. The key turned in the lock, and I pulled it free, shoving Susie inside and swinging myself around, staring in horror at the crowd of people not 5 feet away. I shoved my shoulder against the barn door and screamed, pushing with all my might to try and close it before they could reach us. But just as it came within inches of shutting, the fingers of one of the people grabbed hold of it, barely keeping it from closing. I planted my feet and pushed as hard as I could. But soon more fingers filled the gap, pushing against me with the force and weight of 10 people. My legs buckled and slid against the dirt, but I refused to move. I refused to die. Susie tried to put her weight against the door too, but as I looked over to her, I knew I might have no choice but to make the same sacrifice that Sebastian had. I pulled the keys in my hand up and placed them in Susie's confused care. Under the tractor, there's a door, I screamed, my feet sliding forward another inch from the weight pushing behind me. Use the black key and open it, I demanded, using a free hand to push Susie in the direction of the old tractor parked inside of the barn. She hesitated a moment, scared to leave me alone for even a second. Do it! Open it! I cried, sliding forward another inch, and then another. Any moment now, they'd be able to fit through the growing gap in the door. Susie ran towards the tractor and knelt down, thrashing her hands around on the ground until she had cleared enough hay to reveal a dark metal door that looked like the kind of entrance that would lead to a tornado or bomb shelter. Sebastian had never mentioned it, not in the entire time we'd known each other. And now, whatever it was the only hope we had of escaping with our lives. Susie turned the key in the lock and looked back to me just as the door was pushed open enough for the infected horde of people on the other side to begin funneling in. I landed on my stomach and sucked in a breath full of dirt, watching as my daughter struggled to pull the metal door up off the ground, using all her strength to try and hoist it up before we were surrounded. I pushed myself forward with my legs and clawed at the ground with my hands, scurrying forward on all fours as I felt the cold touch of hands graze against my clothes, barely escaping their grip. Then, just as Susie managed to pull the door open enough for us to climb inside, I grabbed hold of her with one hand, placed the other on the side of the door, and lunged into God knows what awaiting us below, crashing down a pitch-black staircase as the faint glimmer of light from the outside world disappeared when the metal door slammed shut locking the infected out and us in.